All right, we're joined now by former NHL general manager Dave Nonis, who has become a regular, I would say, right, on the Ray and Dregs hockey podcast.
Yeah, one of the highlights of his career, I think.
Well, considering some of the lowlights, I think that there's somewhere in the middle there, not to be fair. All right, Dave, why don't we walk through some of the stuff that went on? And living it firsthand, the trade season actually started. I mean, if you want to identify where it got going, I guess it'd be that January 30th trade between the Canucks and the Islanders, where Horvat, the biggest piece of the trade season at that point, gets shifted to the Islanders. And then you go to, February 17th, where the Leafs make their trade with the Blues, O'Reilly and O'Chari coming back to Toronto, then followed by Boston, Washington, Orlov, and Hathaway, and all of that. Are we likely to see more of this in terms of a staggered deadline in the years to come, or is so much of this related to the salary cap? So if there's a bump in the cap, maybe we won't see it as evident as we did this year.
I think we will see it a little bit, but maybe not to this extent. This was remarkable. I mean, I think when you see how many players went early, Horvat, I thought Horvat would go before the deadline, but I didn't think he'd go a month before the deadline. In this situation, I think what happened is some teams identified players that they felt that they needed to have in order to have any chances of success. And I think Lewis was the biggest one and went out and did what he had to do to get the player. Once that happened this year, I think a bunch of other teams did the same thing. They started doing some self-evaluation. This is what I think we need to do. There's only so many players available. Let's be more aggressive and see if we can add them quicker. I think we'll see it again next year, but not to the same extent. I think the day or 2 days before the deadline will still be of some interest, as opposed to this year when there really wasn't a whole lot of players remaining on that last day.
So, Dave, that first trade happens, and then there's a little bit of a lull, and you say, okay, so other teams got to make the decision that they're going to sell or buy, whatever it might be at that time. When the first big chip goes, is there a ripple effect, like we got to get going, everybody's going to get going, or are you still just kind of plodding away in your own pace and your own internal room?
There is a heightened sense of urgency, I think, for some teams, particularly those ones that have a chance to win. I think they have a chance to win. They need to add a piece in their mind in order to to be really competitive, and you'll sit down prior to the deadline and you'll put together kind of a range of what you're willing to pay. For example, I'm certain that New Jersey put together a range that they were willing to pay for Timo Meier, and the bottom end of that range isn't what they ended up paying. They had to pay at the top end of that range. And once some of the other teams around them start to add pieces, you look at what your range is and you step out and say, are we willing to pay the top end of what we were talking about? And if we are, let's go ahead and do it. That's how I'm certain how these trades all kind of came to fruition. It was just, this is what we have to do if we want the player. And if we're prepared to do it, let's do it 10 days before the deadline as opposed to, 2 days before the deadline.
Okay, so you've set your bottom end and your top end, and you get right down to the nitty gritty on player A. How often do you step outside the top end where you go, we're not going past this, and oh crap, here we go.
Here we go.
It does happen, but really, if you've done a pretty good job of what you're willing to pay, your top end is probably a little bit heavy anyway.
Okay.
In other words, you've said this is going to be a staggering trade for us to do, but are we willing to do it? And I think that's what you're seeing now. And also, there's a seller's range as well. I'm pretty certain that they were asking for more than that for Timo Meier. So their range, if you're a seller, you're looking at your bottom end and your top end as well. And sometimes, that comes down to meet in the middle, and that's when the trade gets executed.
Okay, so now you've set your range, they've set their range, the trade's made, and it's not you. What goes through your mind? The player, Timo Meier was not going to only New Jersey. There were plenty of teams that were in there deep. So of those other teams, what is the first thought that's going through their head, and what do they do next?
Well, you have another player on your list, and sometimes you have 3 or 4 players on your list, and you go through the same song and dance with those guys to see if you can land that player. At the end of the day, if you end up with nothing, but you've tried your best to get these deals completed, you've put your best offers out. You put an offer that you think is more than fair. It doesn't hurt the franchise long term, and you don't get the player. That's part of the game. I mean, sometimes there are other teams out there that are willing to pay more than market value to get the player done. And if that happens, then that happens. I think you have to be cognizant of where you are as an organization and what you're willing to pay. And if someone else is willing to step outside that and do it, well, then that's how they run their business.
All right. Well, to just paint the picture for how this process comes together. All right. And, we call them war rooms, and that's where, the general manager and the management group and the scouting staff, whomever is in that room, on deadline day or free agent frenzy, whatever, I envision a whiteboard, right? And it probably gets developed at a pro scouting meeting, maybe even some of your amateur scouting meetings. I don't know, well in advance of the trade deadline. But is it literally a list of names on a board and you wipe them off, or you juggle that list depending on what you see your needs are or how your appetite for an individual player changes?
Yeah, definitely. So you'll put together a list, and the list is not just one list. You'll have first line centers, first line wingers. You'd have depth player list. You'd have a list for hard players. You might have lists for toughness. So you've got a bunch of those lists together. It's not just one list from 1 to 150.
Right.
Because you might be looking for different things throughout the course of either the trade deadline or, like you said, free agency. So you put those together. Once a guy's off the board, it used to be like you just said, a whiteboard, and you put an X through them. Now we're a little bit more savvy, and you got computers. You have someone on it right away, and then the player that was number 6 on your list just magically disappears. But yeah, that's how it works, and a lot of time goes into it. The pro scouts spend a lot of time, really from January 1st on. There's several meetings getting ready for the trade deadline. After the deadline, they give them a break, but then you get ready. You have another meeting as you get close to the draft, because free agency is run basically the same way. It's what is out there, what are our needs, what are we willing to pay.
What's the difference mindset-wise, trade deadline to free agency? Or does it feel as urgent?
Trade deadline, it can. Yeah, it definitely can. Trade deadline, you're dealing with another team directly. You're trying to negotiate with the team, and you're giving up assets. In free agency, you're negotiating with the player and the agent, and you're giving up cap space. You're giving up money, and they're obviously both very important. But there's some of the biggest mistakes that teams make, I think, are being overly aggressive in free agency. I think we're all guilty of that. You try to get pieces that you think are going to be big pieces for you going forward. Sometimes it's the pieces that are the middle of the road pieces, are the number 4 defenseman that turn out to be a much better ad than trying to be very, very aggressive. And for that reason, it's important to have a pretty solid list. I mean, I'll give you an example. Going back to Vancouver, for me, it was important to get Willie Mitchell. He wasn't the sexiest player available in free agency, but he was a player that we needed, that we needed to have. We needed that piece. And, I actually went and met with him in Granville Island to try to talk him into coming. And it was important that we added that player. It wasn't the top player available, but it was the player that we needed the most in order for our franchise to go forward.
Deadline day is over. Now what for the managers? So you can't make any trades. Must drive you guys crazy.
Yeah, it's time to go scouting.
Yeah,
that's really get out on the road a little bit. If you're a team that's not going to be in the playoffs, you want to have a decent handle on the draft. At least the top 15 or 20 players, and not because you're going to override your staff, but because it's important to see what you might be getting in terms of value. So you'll do that. Hopefully your American League team is having some success. You want to see what your prospects are doing, and then after that, you start preparing for the draft and for free agency.
All right, Dave, we'll leave you this. I think this will put a bow on it until there's reason to kind of dig deeper with the clubs that added specific players and whether those players have returned dividends and all that. We probably won't know that until we get later into the end of the second half and possibly into the playoffs. But is there one team that added enough to change your view on how they stack up now with roughly 20 games left?
Well, I'm going to break away from your question. I'm going to give you two teams.
Okay.
I think that Edmonton, just by adding Ekholm, added enough so that they could possibly win the division. Is that going to be enough for them to win the cup? I'm not certain that their bottom pairing is good enough to do that. But I think by adding that style of defenseman, I think it's really going to help them moving forward and be tougher to play against. The one team that I think added enough in order to make themselves even harder to beat is Boston.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to believe that the team that's running away with it may have had the most successful trade deadline of all the clubs available. And again, we talk about pieces that are important to add, that are good fits. I think that their pieces are great fits. Obviously, Orlov is having a real amazing start with the club. And I thought Bertuzzi looked pretty good in his first effort there as well. I think that those two pieces are going to be big for them, and it probably puts them even further ahead of the field.
Okay, quick one just to follow up. Is it easier? It's easier when you need less, but is it easier to target shop like the Bruins as opposed to a team that you go, I think we're pretty good, but maybe not. You could improve in 4 or 5 areas. The Bruins are looking for a D-man, an aggressive forward. Then they had an injury and they went and got Bertuzzi. Like, it was pretty straightforward. You still got to execute.
Yeah, you do. But I think you make a good point. If that's where self-evaluation is important for a playoff team. What do we actually need? Mm-hmm. And do we need the best player available? No. I mean, sometimes that can actually cause problems if your lineup is already running effectively. But what do we need? Identify it and go get it. And that's what they did. And they did it very effectively. I thought they did it again. I thought they did it well last year is when they got Hampus Lindholm. Mm-hmm. That's what they felt they needed. They went out and did it. Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. When you have a couple of holes in the wrong areas, maybe softer spots that you want to shore up, it does make it easier. And again, I think that team has done a real good job of evaluating where they are and what they needed.
Excellent stuff, Dave. Thanks for doing this pre-deadline, post-deadline. Wrap things up. We look forward to catching up with you in the near future.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Dave.